So I would pity anybody who has to go after Mike. So right now I'm feeling extremely sorry for myself. The other thing I should say is I spend most of my time holed up in a research laboratory. I'm a neuroscientist by training, getting into psychology and also education. But mostly I'm under fluorescent lighting in a windowless room with my other students. And once in a while, people let me out to speak to people like you. So I'm very, very grateful and happy to be here today. And thank you for the warm welcome. Okay, so today I'll talk to you a little bit about the science of learning, which is an area that's it's multidisciplinary. It's just starting to come to the fore. And it really is based on the blending of multiple different arenas. And what I'll tell you today is some of the findings from this that I think most of them will simply reinforce what you've already intuited about your practice of teaching. But at least now you'll have some concrete evidence that you can use to support your ideas. Okay, well, this is not working for me, so I'm just going to stand here, unfortunately. Oh, no, it is. Okay. So I always start with the brain, but we're going to talk mostly about behavioral data today. There are a number of different brain systems. One of them, various ones that focus on attention or memory or motivation, all of which are absolutely essential for learning. Oh, dear. I'm just going to stand here. And so one of these is the prefrontal cortex, which is basically a third of the human brain here. And I'll be talking a lot more about this region in the afternoon. And prefrontal is really important for focusing your attention, ignoring distractors, organizing information, integrating various sources of information, for example, across classes, planning, decision-making, reasoning, all of this, essentially what makes us human. Then we have the hippocampus, this structure deep in the brain that's shown in green, that's essential for forming new memories and then retrieving them later. And also we have the basal ganglia, also deep in the brain, that's essential for motivation and for reinforcement of learning. And so every factor, essentially anything about our body that influences attention, memory, motivation, anything inside us or outside in the classroom, in the way that the teacher interacts with you, is going to be having its effects through these brain systems. Let's talk first about attention, which relies on prefrontal cortex. What would you think is the biggest impediment to attention in our college classes today? This is something Mike already alluded to. Yeah, exactly. So multitasking, this is from college students at public universities in the Northeast, so not Boston College. And this is the percentage of students who self-report that they're texting sometimes or somewhat or very frequently. This is 70% of the students texting, like 25% doing Facebook, email, search, instant messaging, or even talking, I guess talking to one another, since we would notice if they were talking on the phone. Okay, so this is a lot of students doing a lot of other things other than attending to us, which is obviously demoralizing. And these ones are negatively correlated with their GPA, even after you account for their high school grades, their SAT scores, et cetera, which is not to say that the rest of this is all okay, obviously. Another thing I want to point out is these are students rating sort of reflecting on the factors that interfere with their own ability to learn in class. And this one surprises me a lot. The highest factor is other students' computer use. So if you're trying to learn and the person next to you is shopping for shoes online, that's obviously going to impact you, in fact, just as much as your own computer use. To take this a step further, let's look at what actually is happening, because a lot of students will tell me, oh, but I use my laptop to take notes. And I always show these slides at the beginning of this every semester. And so I want to show you some of these data from a beautiful study at Princeton recently. What they did was they assigned college students randomly to classrooms that were equipped either with laptops or with notebooks and pens, old school. Everybody listened to the same lectures that were videotaped, and they were instructed to use their usual note-taking strategy, either on the laptop or with their old school notebook. 30 minutes later, they were tested on factual recall of the material as well as conceptual understanding. So guess which students took more notes and wrote down more of the lecture verbatim? Okay. When tested on facts, whom do you think did better? Okay. When tested on ideas, whom do you think did better? Okay, so the answers are, obviously the laptops, they took down more notes. They can do it more quickly. We can all type faster than we can write these days. When tested on facts, they were tied. And when tested on ideas, the notebook won out. Why do you think that is? You have to process the information. You can't write as quickly as you can type, and so you have to, kind of get it down to the gist and then write that down. So you have to process, you have to actively engage with the material. Okay, so then they took it a step further, and they did different students, same idea, randomly assigned to the 2 classrooms. And now, instead of testing the understanding of the material 30 minutes after, this was actually when it came time to study for the exam in the course. Whom do you think benefited more? The ones who had the detailed notes that had been typewritten, or the ones with the messy, shorter handwritten notes when tested on facts and when tested on ideas? Handwritten, both ways. I show this every semester, and at this point, I don't even have to ask the students to put away their laptops. They just do it naturally. It's just kind of an understood thing in the class at that point. So then they said, okay, so we know that with laptops, people just kind of tend to be stenographers. They tend to write everything down. But then what they said was, okay, try not to do that. Try to do what you would do if you were taking notes by hand. Try to just get the gist. And the students were unable to do that. They just reverted to typing like that. So another important aspect of attention, even when you're focused on the class and you're not doing anything else, is that it wanes extremely rapidly. And our classes that are 50 minutes or even an hour and a half, I've even had some that were 3 hours long, God forbid, are just not designed for this kind of thing. Not only this kind of situation here where I'm giving a PowerPoint and you're passively listening, but just essentially, attention is going to wane rapidly. This, I think, is kind of a theoretical plot, but it's based on data of just subjective reports of students of their own attention. It starts out really high. You have like a good 10 minutes with the students before it absolutely plummets. And then here, I don't know, I think they're thinking about lunch or next class or whatever it is. But and so what can we do to combat this extremely important problem, right? I mean, we prepare 50 minutes of content, and then they're checking out after 10, 15 minutes. So we obviously have to engage in change. Anything that's novel is gonna bring the attention right back, I mean, instantaneously, right? If I were to stand up on this desk, I'd get you all focusing again. And so really, roughly every 10, 15 minutes or so, we should be trying to build into our lectures some sort of a thought question, group activity, some sort of a demo, even a joke, these sorts of things, maybe a photo, an image that takes them out of this realm and pushes them into a new one. And so the idea, the hope, is that you can get people's attention back periodically every 10 to 15 minutes. Okay? Still not perfect, but better than not. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about these various factors. I've talked a bit about attention. The next one is memory. Obviously, memory and learning are essentially one and the same. Here's some more really depressing data that we've had basically since the 1880s. This is how quickly people forget. Okay, this is like tightly controlled experimental stuff where you're just learning very, very simple stuff, okay? But the assumption is that at time 1, you understood everything, you remember everything, and even if that's true, which is never true, there's just this incredibly rapid drop-off. At 2 days later, you're retaining 30% of what you learned, 25%, 6 days later, and then, a month later, you're down to, 10, 15% of the material. So what are we doing in our classes, and how can we avoid this? Well, one way is by having students space their learning such that they engage with the material regularly. And so there's lots of good evidence that, if there's restudying of the material, you can actually retain the material over time. Okay? So this is pretty good. And then the question is, what kind of spacing is important for students to re-engage with the material? Well, not mass learning, which is you take in a whole semester or half a semester, and then you study the night before the exam, and then you dump it out. That's associated with incredible forgetting, but rather re-engaging very regularly. not, every single day, but at a point when forgetting has started to happen so that it is cognitively engaging, it's difficult to re-engage with the material, but not at a point where you've completely forgotten all the material and you have to start over from square one. So, depending on the subject matter, this is going to vary quite a bit. All right. And maybe we can talk more about how you structure your classes in such a way to encourage students to engage regularly with the material. For example, having a quiz on the very next session of the class after some new material has been learned. Okay, so this issue of testing that I just brought up is actually really, really important. Testing is not just a form of assessment, it's actually a way to enhance learning. So this is a study at Washington University where students got these prose passages that they had to read, and then they had to free recall them, just everything that they remembered from these passages. And then they had a series of study sessions of 5 minutes or test sessions of 5 minutes each. And the question was, what is more helpful to you, just rereading the passage or testing yourself? Okay? And so students were asked to rate their interest in the topic, and it turns out that if you're testing yourself along the way, that you find it more interesting. Whatever you're reading is more interesting than if you're studying it over and over. But interestingly, if you're asked about your confidence and your ability to remember, the people who are restudying and restudying are actually more confident that they're going to learn more. And this is probably what drives students to engage so passively in their material when they're studying for an exam, that they think, oh, this is a good way to do it. Just reread the textbook over and over, and eventually I'll get this. But then when we look at the actual data of how they perform, what we have here is different conditions. So this is where students study the material in these 5-minute increments, study, 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 study. This is where they got to test themselves. And this is where they tested themselves repeatedly after the first study session. And this is the amount of forgetting over 1 week, so higher is worse. And you can see that they did best when they were repeatedly testing themselves. Okay. Another topic that Mike touched on was this idea of deep learning as opposed to surface learning. So surface learning, just kind of memorizing mindlessly in an isolated way, not making connections with each other, and with no sort of sense of what the greater purpose is. That's associated with very poor long-term retention, whereas actively engaging in the material, sort of rotating new ideas around, trying to integrate them is obviously really, really important and leads to higher confidence in your memory. If you want to learn more about these ideas about how to promote memory, this is a fantastic book from those folks at Washington University who did this research, Make It Stick. Okay, so next I want to touch on, this is really a broad overview here. We could get much more deep into any of these topics, but the next thing I want to do is touch on the issue of motivation, which is absolutely essential, and Mike showed us exactly how to motivate his students one by one. Let's go into the brain for just a moment here. We have these cells deep in the brain that produce a neurochemical called dopamine that's absolutely essential for motivation. And the way that dopamine works is it's released into the brain, and it modulates activity of the whole brain, essentially, whenever something novel happens or whenever you receive an unexpected reward. And then dopamine starts to fire, essentially, when whenever you're expecting a future reward, and it engages you, it mobilizes you to try to seek out that reward. It makes you very goal-directed. So anticipating a future reward is really helpful. And when dopamine is released throughout the brain, the first thing that it does is it boosts working memory. Working memory, the ability to keep information in mind so that you can manipulate it, reorganize it, use it. So it boosts performance over the short term. The other thing that dopamine does is it reinforces learning. It lays down it helps to lay down the networks, essentially, that form new memories. And so what it does is it increases the chances that you're going to be able to, again, do the thing that was previously rewarded. Okay, I hope you're with me so far. That's sort of, we're going to come back out to the behavior in just a moment. But the really important thing about the dopamine system is that it gets bored extremely quickly, okay? If you get the same reward over and over and over again, it loses its oomph. And then you just don't have any more motivation to engage with the material. So let's think for a moment about students' motivations, right? Again, something that Mike touched on. The first is extrinsic motivation, which is the entire way that courses are structured around grades. And so students are either motivated to achieve or get the best grade in the class, or they're motivated deeply by a fear of failure, just anxiety around being the worst in the class. Now, intrinsic motivation, this is, again, this sense of wonder that we talked about, this sense of curiosity and play. It's when you enjoy the activity for its own sake. So I want to sit in, I want to take Mike's classes myself. I mean, they sound super exciting. When you're motivated by interest and curiosity, and how do you harness this? And this is something I want to talk about later. How do we restructure our classes so that students are not so focused on grades? I mean, it's not always easy to say, okay, nobody's going to get a grade at all in this class. So I want to talk more about how we do this later on. And the other really kind of depressing thing is that if you get rewarded for something that you actually naturally enjoy, your interest in that starts to wane. There's excellent research from Stanford by a woman named Carol Dweck, who's shown that with children, if you reward them with little toys or something like that for making drawings, that they naturally would have done anyway, at a certain point they won't even draw anymore on their own unless they're going to get a reward. Whether this translates up to college classes is unclear, but I think it's really important to keep in mind. Okay, so when students are intrinsically motivated, they obviously enjoy the process more, that's by definition. They show longer-term retention. This is research out of Stanford. They apply their knowledge more often. They engage in deep learning. They demonstrate higher academic achievement, and they perceive themselves as more competent. So this is what we should be all striving towards. And there are ways to assess students' goal orientation. There are questionnaires out there that you can use that you could use to help students reflect on why they're taking a class. This is a set of items that allow you to see whether a student has a mastery goal. I like classwork that I'll learn from, even if I'll make lots of mistakes. The reason I do it is because I want to learn new things. I like classwork best when it really makes me think, etc. And there are other questions that are geared towards seeing whether they're motivated by performance goals, either achieving or not failing, essentially. And there are other scales that you can use to assess teachers and how teachers inspire or fail to inspire these mastery goals. And so I'll provide all my slides, and you can get this link, and start to evaluate. They even have ones for entire institutions. So just to think about how your school is doing as a whole. Okay. One thing that Mike touched on here is the importance of playful learning. And the reason that playful learning is so important is that the ingredients of play are precisely those that we know promote learning. And play is often something that's relegated to preschool, kindergarten classes, and then later on we end up with these lectures that are extremely unplayful, right? So why is play important? Well, first of all, it's intrinsically motivating, as we talked about. Secondly, it provides an opportunity for novel experiences. And as I just mentioned, dopamine fires when something is new. It allows us to engage actively, which is obviously important, and it allows us to learn from others. We know that students learn very well from their peers, at least as well as from teachers, if not more so. And while you're at it, you could be strengthening social bonds, which is important. Now, engaging these kind of joyful activities is going to reduce stress levels. And I could have had a section on this, but it's very clear now that chronic stress of the kind that students have year in, year out, taking exam after exam, actually starts to shrivel a part of the brain that's really important for memory. The hippocampus. Cells actually die in the hippocampus when you're exposed to chronic levels of stress. A little bit of stress in a transient way is actually good. It enhances performance, but not this kind of slow trickle over time. A lot of great research on that from Robert Sapolsky at Stanford. Okay. So here are some more ideas for classroom activities that can make us more playful. So some things we can do, we can prepare hands-on activities. Sometimes these are a waste of time and students have no idea what the demonstration showed or why. But if you can lay down some of the content first and then give the demonstration and then link it back to the theory, then it can be extremely powerful. Enthusiasm is really, really important. Making clear why the material is going to be useful in real life rather than just for getting a good grade. Making connections to topics that interest students, trying to make it less dry, more applicable. Analogies are a fantastic way to do this. You don't want to overemphasize analogies. I study analogical reasoning, and I'll be talking about reasoning in the afternoon. And so I try to come up with an analogy for everything, and I start to mix my metaphors because I've got so many different analogies in the lecture, which is not good. But one well-chosen analogy can really just bring all the material home. Okay, and so again, how do we de-emphasize grades? And my way of doing this is to explain to them that intrinsic motivation is actually going to get them much farther and lead to higher achievement in the course in the long run. Okay, the last thing that I want to touch on with respect to motivation is this issue of mindsets. We all have different beliefs about intelligence. Some of us think that intelligence is a static trait. It's genetically mediated, and you just, the luck of the draw, the lottery either leads you to be actually smart or not smart. And as a teacher, having this idea about your students is extremely pernicious and counterproductive, right? And then other people have a growth mindset, which is that intelligence is like any other skill. It's something that's developed through practice. And I'll be showing some data this afternoon that shows just how the brain is changed by the experience of reasoning. And so this fixed mindset is actually very common in the United States, much less so in Asia, where there's much more of an emphasis on practice makes perfect. And the idea is essentially that if you fail a test or you don't understand a concept, it's not that you're stupid, it's that you just haven't worked hard enough yet. Not yet, which is, again, this concept that Mike brought up. The really bad thing about a fixed mindset is that if you think that every assessment is an assessment that reflects on who you are as a person, how good of a person you are, then it's extremely nerve-wracking to engage in assessments, and it's not acceptable to fail. And what does this lead students to do when there's no possibility for failure? It leads them to not want to take any kind of risks, not take a class that might be too challenging, not try to go beyond the material, stay focused on the material that's going to be tested, et cetera. So there's actually good evidence now that there are benefits to be reaped by having a growth mindset. First of all, it significantly raises students' grades and their achievement test scores. Secondly, it particularly helps underrepresented minorities. It helps them to stay engaged and achieve well, even in the face of these rampant stereotypes against them. And it creates a love of learning and a resilience that's essential for great accomplishment. There's another book, so I highly recommend that book, Mindset, by Carol Dweck. Really, really a worthwhile read. But there's another book that's really great, also by a cognitive scientist named Dan Willingham, Why Don't Students Like School? And he's got a number of recommendations that are based on this work on mindsets. The first one is to praise effort, not ability. If you keep telling someone, oh, you're really gifted, you're really smart, that leads them to reinforce their idea of themselves as a fixed person with fixed attributes. If you praise effort, that leads them to want to try harder. Showing students that you have confidence in them, essentially this comes back to this idea that you have to get rid of the notion that you have some students who are smart and some students who aren't. You need to start with yourselves to reconceptualize this idea of brain systems that are fully worked up, that are functioning optimally, versus ones that still need exercise. Okay. It's important to treat failure as a natural part of learning. How do we promote that? How do we make that possible? And students don't often have good study skills, and we take for granted that they know how to engage with the material, but as I said, most students will just reread the textbook without engaging in it, without testing themselves regularly, actively. Okay, so The last thing that I want to touch on before I get to the final topic of brain health is the importance of teaching assistants, and I know that you have them here at Boston College. They're perceived as less intimidating than faculty, more approachable, more understanding. Why is this helpful? Well, as I just mentioned, anxiety really impedes learning, and rapport with an instructor boosts motivation. Teaching assistants are also perceived as more enthusiastic than faculty. They, you know, when you've been teaching the same class over and over again, it's hard to stay enthusiastic. And this is really important. Teaching assistant enthusiasm increases the likelihood of retention in the sciences, you know, just as one example. They're also seen as more flexible, more informal than faculty, which means that they're in a position to create an atmosphere that's more conducive to playful learning and inquiry, breaking out into smaller groups. All of this is really important. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about is the importance of other factors about brain health that influence brain health. And there are two in particular. The first one is sleep. Mike showed us that student who was sleeping. This is unfortunately really common, so I want to read you this quote. Campus life is like a giant laboratory experiment designed for maximal sleep deprivation. Irregular schedules, newfound freedom, endless social interaction, loud and crowded housing, late-night exercise, and food washed down with booze, coffee, and energy drinks. Okay? This is what we're fighting against. This is, I think, the biggest impediment to learning, aside from multitasking. And I've been heavily influenced by two of my colleagues at Berkeley, Matt Walker and Alison Harvey, who study the effects of sleep deprivation on memory, mood, and mental health issues. Okay? So these are some data from Matt Walker's lab. This is after a night of sleep deprivation in Tolman Hall in our psychology department in the basement. They have students either sleep or spend the whole night up playing games, eating snacks. And then they study how much they can learn the next day. And there's a 40% reduction in how much they can learn after a night of sleep deprivation. And moreover, when you zoom into that region of the brain that's important for memory consolidation and retrieval, the hippocampus, what you see is a massive reduction in the ability to engage this region when you're encoding new material. So these are students, they're lying in the MRI scanner. We're getting measures of their blood flow to this region of the brain that's so important for memory, and they're encoding new information, and you know their brain is checked out. It's offline. These also are data that I show to students, although I haven't done anything like see whether these kinds of data help them to get on a more regular sleep schedule. But Matt Walker has done this. He teaches a whole semester about sleep and the brain, and by the end he finds that students are sleeping on average an hour more than beforehand. So really impressive stuff. Okay, and the last thing is cardiovascular exercise. It's very easy as a student to just focus entirely on your schoolwork and not appreciate just how important cardiovascular exercise is going to be to help you learn. So what are the ways in which it does that? Many ways, in fact. It leads to increased blood flow to the brain, which brings oxygen, glucose, and much needed nutrients to the brain cells. It actually stimulates the growth of new cells in the hippocampus. Remember, stress reduces the number of cells. It kills brain cells. And cardiovascular exercise is the exact opposite. The hippocampus is the only part of the brain where new cells are actually born. New neurons are born throughout life. And they're important for learning new information. And exercise helps with this. The other thing that it does is not only increase the pool of neurons, but it increases connections between neurons. Really important. And over time, it improves resilience to stress. So when you first start exercising, you get a release of cortisol, that's the stress hormone. But over time, you get a smaller release of cortisol every time you experience a stressor, and that carries over into the anxiety that you feel in class, etc. So it helps you to regulate your stress hormone levels. It has short-term boosts for mood, stress, concentration, and memory that last for several hours after a period of exercise. And then the long-term benefits, the structural changes in the brain, they start to emerge in as little as 6 months of regular exercise. So this is another area that I think is really important to emphasize to students. With that, I want to end and take some comments.